On March 28, 1757, four horses spent an hour pulling at Robert Damiens before the executioner gave up and reached for a knife. Damiens was a domestic servant from a village near Arras, who had drifted through aristocratic households in Paris for years. On January 5th, he slipped past guards at Versailles as Louis XV was getting into his carriage and pushed a small penknife into the king's side. Louis staggered, certain he was dying, and called for a priest to take his confession. His wound turned out to be less than half an inch deep. The king lived. But raising any blade against the anointed body of a French monarch was the worst crime imaginable, and the Parliament of Paris decided that an ordinary execution would not be enough. On the morning of March 28th, the cart took Damiens from the Conciergerie to the Place de Grève. The scaffold was already drawn out, and the crowd stood 10 deep on every side. Windows around the square had been rented by counts, ambassadors, and a Venetian adventurer named Giacomo Casanova, who watched for the next 4 hours and wrote down what he saw. The court had sentenced Damiens to the death reserved for regicides. He would be made amende honorable in front of Notre Dame, dragged on a hurdle to the scaffold, and held there for whatever ordeal the executioner needed. The Paris office of Barreau ran in the Sanson family by inheritance. The chief was bedridden, so his brother stepped in from Reims with the chief's 18-year-old son, Charles-Henri Sanson, as his apprentice. They began by burning Damiens's right hand, the hand that had held the knife, with sulfur. They tore strips of flesh from his thighs, calves, and chest with red-hot pincers. Into each wound they poured molten wax, molten lead, and boiling oil. Damiens did not faint. He asked the priest beside him for absolution, and once for a drink. 4 horses were then harnessed to ropes tied to each of his limbs, and at a signal the drivers whipped the animals away from the scaffold in 4 directions. The ropes pulled taut, the horses strained. Damiens's joints did not separate. A second hour began. More horses were brought up and added to the harness, but the shoulders and hips still held. The uncle walked to the magistrate's table and asked permission to cut the sinews. It was granted. The blade went through the tendons at the shoulders and hips, the horses pulled again, and this time they came away with 4 limbs. The crowd applauded as the limbs lifted clear of the platform. Casanova wrote that the ladies in the windows beside him stayed for every minute of it. The torso was thrown onto a pyre and burned for the rest of the day. The ashes were scattered to the wind. Within a week, Parliament ordered Damiens's house demolished, his wife and daughter banished from France under threat of death if they returned, his brothers and sisters forced to change their names, and his name struck from civil records. 200 years later, the philosopher Michel Foucault opened a book about the modern prison by transcribing the sentence word for word. The young assistant, Charles-Henri Sanson, kept the family office. 36 years later, he took less than a minute to do the same job on the king's grandson with a guillotine. The guillotine itself was proposed by Dr. Guillotin to spare aristocrats the 4-hour version Damiens got. Sanson's next royal apologized for stepping on his foot, then lost her head on the same Paris scaffold. Like and subscribe.